Welcome everybody to the Natural Areas Association State Natural Areas Program Roundtable. This is the third roundtable for this year, and we've got an exciting topic for you today, the role of groundwater in natural area stewardship. Mike Leahy's going to join us here in a moment and tell you a little bit more about the specifics of the roundtable today. We've got great presenters and a great program for you. I wanted to mention that we are conducting these roundtables as meetings as opposed to webinars. And for anybody familiar with Zoom, that simply just means that you're able to participate more fully by turning your video on and your audio. Today, we are, again, offering our roundtable, which is a really unique opportunity for those of you who manage natural areas for state agencies. Particularly to learn from experts and each other on a variety of topics relevant to your day-to-day responsibilities. This is not exclusive to state agency personnel, but that's the foundation of this particular program that NAA supports and facilitates. So our goal is not only to provide you with a learning opportunity, but to create an environment where you can meet new colleagues so that we can be a resource for one another in our work. So let me just, for those of you who are kind of new to NAA, let me just say a few things about the organization. We're a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to the support and advancement of natural areas professionals, those who protect biodiversity through science-based conservation, stewardship, and advocacy. We are in an engaged community of peers and colleagues who form a resource that can respond to questions, propose ideas, share methodologies, and advance best practices. And we design programming in the spirit of creating those opportunities for you. I want to just take this opportunity to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have that you may be interested in. For many of you, you know that we host a webinar series, and this year's webinar series is offered on the third Tuesday of every month at noon Eastern Time. On August 17th, the webinar that we'll be offering is presented by researcher Todd Esk. Todd recently published this work in our Natural Areas Journal, and he's going to be presenting a very informative webinar on prioritizing species lists to restore desert tortoise and pollinator habitats in the Mojave Desert shrublands. Specific information specific to that site, but the information is broad in its applicability. So tune into that if you're focused on native plants and restoration. November 16th, Dr. Desiree Narango will be presenting the topic using informed plant selection to restore pollinators and songbirds in human-dominated landscapes. Anybody familiar with Doug Tallamy's work might want to tune in to Desiree's talk. Desiree is a postdoc with Dr. Tallamy. And we are going to host the Natural Areas Conference this year, contrary to the behavior of this virus that we're all dealing with. It will be another virtual conference. It's going to be a one-day conference, and it will be October 19th, focused on invertebrate conservation. The title is Life from the Ashes, exploring the impact of prescribed and natural fire on insects and other invertebrates. The Xerces Society is co-hosting this conference with us. This will be a one-day symposium on the topic. We encourage you to register soon if you're interested. We've got early bird prices and team registration deals going on right now. So do visit our website at naturalareas.org to register for the conference. We'll have some other conference elements, including the Felon Becker Awards this year, as well as some other fun opportunities for you to take advantage of on that day. We hope to see you there. So today's roundtable is the product of a committee of your peers led by Mike Leahy, who runs the Missouri Natural Areas Program. And Mike has been the chair of this roundtable for a number of years now, out of his passion for this work that you all do. So I'd like to introduce you to Mike, or I'd like to introduce Mike, who'll tell you a little bit more about today's roundtable.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us today. The State Natural Areas Program Roundtable has been around for a number of years to support state natural area program workers and other related folks working on natural area stewardship. across the country. And today's topic, the role of groundwater in natural area stewardship, will focus on the important component of the ecological functioning of our natural communities that basically rely on groundwater. However, groundwater is often overlooked because it's out of mind, out of sight, compared to things such as lakes, soils, streams, and vegetation. During this virtual State Natural Area Program Roundtable, our speakers are going to cover a number of different Karst systems to begin a conversation on the role of groundwater in our natural areas. And of course, groundwater is a component of many other natural communities besides Karst, but we're going to highlight Karst systems as a way to basically start this conversation. We're also excited to launch a new element to the roundtable, our stewardship shorts. These are 5-minute pre-recorded videos related to the topic, today being groundwater, that describe a project, a methodology, a best practice, or a challenge in natural area stewardship and management. And so we've got 3 excellent videos from folks today that are colleagues and peers, and the presenters will be available for live questions and answers after their presentations. So today we've got 2 lead presenters. This includes a colleague of mine, Frank Nelson, and Dr. John Evans, and we'll lead off with Frank, who earned a MS in Fisheries and Wildlife from the University of Missouri-Columbia, where he studied wetland systems and the breeding ecology of least bitterns. Over the past 17 years, Frank has worked for the Missouri Department of Conservation as a wetland ecologist, where his focus has been applying research and technology to enhance wetland management, monitoring, and restoration. Frank's talk today is the new Karst Fen ecological site description. And with that.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And yes, so today I get to talk to you all about Karst Fens. It's a new ecological site description. I really appreciate the opportunity to, and I'm presenting this as part of my collaborators and co-authors, Kyle Steele with the U.S. Forest Service, Justin Thomas, Nature Site, and Doug Wallace with NRCS. So as I get this project rolling, I want to kind of give you an outline of where I'm headed essentially today. I'm going to talk about some foundational sources of information, Karst systems, both nationally and in Missouri, and then the groundwater connections and this gradient of springs that exists, and histic soils in Missouri. And then that'll lead us into the ecological dynamics in the states and community phases of these Karst Fens. So essentially, we're building off of work that's already been done. There's a thesis done by Orzel in 1983 on fins that was really fascinating. It's foundational work in Missouri. Paul Nelson's Terrestrial Natural Communities in Missouri built on that, and we're definitely using that information as well. And then Scott George, along with others, recently published a paper on Ozark fins. And so we use this information as a good starting place. But then I've also done a comprehensive literature review to see how fins operate, say up in the Boreal or in Europe. And then also have looked at additional field work on 29 fins in Missouri across a range from eastern to western Missouri, doing botanical surveys as well as soil samples. And so we're doing all this kind of work to basically set up and establish an ecological site description. And this is NRCS and the Forest Service have developed this process as a framework for classifying and describing rangeland and forest communities. It's based upon geolandforms, vegetation, and soil properties, and how that kind of forms this ecological site description. And so really, this is to help direct agency and partner funds and actions towards conserving specific communities, knowing what is the right landscape position or community that you're looking for, and what are the actions to manage or restore these. So to start off, what is Karst? Well, Karst occurs in these areas of exposed soluble bedrock. Oftentimes this is limestone and dolomite, which is carbonate rock. And rainfall, which is slightly acidic, has higher concentrations of CO2, erodes this rock and fractures and faults over millennia. And so this creates these features like sinkholes, losing and gaining streams, caves, springs, glades, and I'll lobby Karst fins are also a part of this Karst system. And so to kind of figure out where does Karst exist in the US, we can look at where carbonate rock exists at or near the land surface. And you have Karst areas along the East Coast. You have these locations that are mid-latitude, mid-continent, You can see Missouri's definitely got a big block of karst. And then additionally, there's locations out west and in Texas that also make up karst. But overall, it's relatively a small amount of land mass, about 16%. However, if you look in Missouri, that proportion increases substantially to 55% of the state. And so, but this is where we have our caves. This is a map of the cave density, as well as where our sinkholes occur. And so this region, this ecological section of Missouri is called the Ozark Highlands. And you can see it also extends down into eastern Oklahoma and northern Arkansas as well. In terms of age, you know, it's taken a lot of time for that water to work on the rocks, essentially. And, you know, from the youngest age, it's 300 million years back to 550 million years, essentially, for this process to occur, essentially. And so the Ozarks, quite honestly, was a plateau. And over time, we've had water work to superficially weather the rock and erode to create the dissected plateau that we have today. The superficial weathering is not the only thing that's been occurring. We also have horizontal and vertical fracturing. These red lines are basically the lineament faults, fracture frequency that you'll see within the state. And you can see here it's not evenly distributed. So underneath the dolomite and limestone, the sedimentary rock essentially of the Ozarks, we have this uneven basement of igneous. And over time, there's been this intermittent periods of uplift, and what is known as the St. Francis Mountains is kind of where this igneous dome occurs. And so as that's occurred, we've had cracking, and the limestone itself has this uneven distribution of geologic fracturing because of this underlying uplift. And we can see that manifested in the streams in the region, and in terms of the streams following the fault lines. And you can see that there's this concentration of faults right around the St. Francis Mountains. And so toward this kind of the center of this dome. And so with water, the geologic fracturing in time, we get the basically karstification, this internal weathering. And this is a great example of epikarst. So this very top layer of a karst system that's highly weathered surface with voids and conduits going both vertically and horizontally for water to move to and through. And so when we think about karst fins, there is definitely a geologic control. 83% of the 560 plus known locations of fins in southern Missouri fall within 4 geologic units. It's the Rubidoux Formation, the Gasconade, Eminence, and Potosi Dolomite. And so it really does fit this model quite nicely. And so thinking about how this geology is Swiss cheese, essentially, that bleeds into or flows into essentially the hydrology and this groundwater connection and this gradient of springs. Now, when we think about wetland types in different regions of our state, the hydrology varies. Groundwater systems like springs, fins, and seeps are driven by this flow of discharge of groundwater. Precipitation really drives, say, our sinkhole ponds, our wet prairies, or even flatwoods. And you might see bogs elsewhere. Elsewhere in Missouri, overland flow drives the processes of our riverine wetlands. And why this is important is because the water chemistry may be different, the landscape position can be influential, and it also may drive plant succession. Now, when we're thinking about the Ozarks highlands and their hydrology, basically the springs and Ozark streams are really this reflection of our leaky lithology. Oftentimes we think of these high discharge springs that's pipe discharge, high flow, perennial, and the spring type would be like emerging in a pool or limnocrene. However, there's a gradient in the spheres of discharge from this high magnitude springs to, say, a wet weather spring that is much more diffuse discharge. Like a seep, you may not have any flow and might be very ephemeral. And then there's a variety of different ways or spring types in which the water can kind of actually come out of the ground. So when we're thinking about karst fins in particular, where do they kind of fit within this gradient? They're really primarily diffuse groundwater discharge, where the groundwater, the soil is saturated from this diffuse flow. However, occasionally we can have these small areas of concentrated discharge, like you can see here at Allen Branch, where water's just seeping out of a particular spot. In terms of magnitude of flow, there is velocity that's observable in as water's moving through these wetlands. It's often can be seen in streamlets. However, overall, the velocity is very minimal, enough to keep the roots, for the roots to keep the organic soil in place. In terms of persistence of flow, it is on the perennial end of the spectrum. These are wet enough and persistent enough that organic matter is being built up over time. Here's a cross section. You can see the dark organic matter and also the depleted matrix, showing that these things are staying saturated for long periods of essentially perennially. On the periphery of a fin, or if the hydrology is altered, these could periodically dry out during periods of extreme heat or drought. In terms of spring type, the primary type is a helichrene spring or a low gradient wetland. However, there are secondary and tertiary types that do occur. For example, the rheocrene, you may see a few channels winding their way through a streamlet or rivulet winding through a fin. And we do have a mound form fin, and there's also the hanging fins, or could be interpreted as a hill slope. Really, but that geologic control is what's driving things here. You have an impermeable layer dictating lateral flow, and therefore you get this discharge and this buildup of organic soil. And these are often flow through systems in which water is continuing to move downstream. And so they can occur on a variety of different landscape positions. With wetlands, we like to think about geomorphic position. It kind of drives things, but with fins, karst fins in particular, they can occur on slopes, they can occur in depressions, or they can also occur in floodplains adjacent to streams. And it's all kind of driven by that groundwater discharge and an impermeable layer. What's a better predictor, quite honestly, is where it is in the watershed. A lot of times our karst fins occur within the headwaters in 0 to 3 order streams. And typically in these sections where losing streams shift to gaining streams. And so this is really important when we're thinking about what are the areas that are contributing to this groundwater discharge. There's been several dye tracing studies looking at trying to figure out this hydrology. And what they've found is that a lot of this is local recharge from the adjacent uplands. And so these are relatively small areas, 100, 200 acres. And there's a short residence time in which the water is kind of rolling off the hills and discharging at these locations. And to kind of think about this, the headwater catchment, let's think of a bucket. And let's throw some dirt and rock in these buckets to kind of model the weathered soil that's occurring. And then let's think about a sponge being our karst fin. And so as we have rain that infiltrates the hillsides, this fills up the locally perched aquifer. And we might think, hey, this is a karst system, therefore we have a large karst conduit like a spigot, but that's not necessarily the case here. Actually, it's maybe a better analogy might be some pinholes to mimic the discrete discharge. And so as water's moving through the weathered soil, they're discharging through these little pinholes essentially and slowly draining through the perched aquifer and making sure that our karst fin soils are maintaining the saturation. However, there's enough capacity that these soils are seasonally recharged, the aquifer refills while maintaining this consistent discharge within the karst fin. And so this discharge then really shapes the histic soils in these locations. Now, karst fins are the only places really in Missouri that has organic soils, outside a few archaic lake beds and some other sinkhole ponds. And so for myself looking at wetland soils, this is really cool stuff because I don't get to see it anywhere else. And that's because of this permanent saturation. It reduces decomposition and therefore peat buildup over time. These spots are often very small, less than 2 acres. They're often inclusions of soil map units, and therefore they're overlooked and unmapped. Occasionally we'll get complexes that can be up to 25 acres of different fens. Grasshopper Hollow is really the only remnant that's that big. And however, we are hoping to propose a new soil series, the B-Fork, which is a histic epiqual, so that these communities can be mapped better in the future. In terms of characteristics, these are poorly drained, near permanent water table at the surface with a depleted matrix. The calcareous setting allows for a high cation exchange capacity. The pH at the surface is typically 6.8 to 7.2. Now, there is quite a bit of variable texture within these, organic to mucky mineral, different layers. You may have some gravels or sands. And there's also variable depth, as you can see from these two profiles. And so this is somewhat dependent upon landform. You can see the one on the left is an epiqual on a slope. So you see that redux in the lower horizon, whereas the one on the right is an endoqual, and you have basically this is formed on a terrace. And so there is some groundwater table interaction here in which it does not go oxic. In terms of the age, this has been really fascinating. We did some radiocarbon dating of 7 sites, and we got this range of between 400 years old to 6,000 years old. And we were kind of wondering, because of the difference in horizon depth, what was the range essentially? And so got a lot more questions than answers, quite honestly. Part of this could be due to the dynamics of karst systems. The subsurface hydrology changes over time. Another thing, it could be beavers, the dynamic of beaver activities, essentially, rather than peat building up from just roots being decomposed or staying decomposed over a long process. Beavers can, increase sediment and organic debris capture in a much shorter time period. And so they, in certain positions, could contribute to the soil development in some of these sites. Essentially, we have a lot more questions and that I'd like to pursue in the future. So this gets kind of into the beavers, gets into some of the ecological dynamics. When we're thinking about this gradient of close to groundwater discharge to, say, the outer perimeter of karst fens, we have these anoxic to oxic conditions. Also, with the geology, you have poor nutrient limitation and maybe some zinc toxicity closer to groundwater discharge, where nutrients are more available further away. And if you think about it, these are really tough conditions for plants to grow. And so you have these short-statured, slow-growing plants that are more diverse communities, whereas further away, you have more tall, fast-growing dominant species that are available. You can handle those conditions. Additionally, there's peat buildup as you get further away, more oxic conditions, you have more breakdown and decomposition, and therefore you have this cycle of more nutrients available for plants. Now, fires definitely occur within the Ozarks in the upland system. However, this is typically further away. More intense fires are occurring further away from that groundwater discharge. And this is really something to be important to think about, is if you're trying to control woodies in a fen, you might actually be breaking down and making nutrients more available, which is why perhaps those woodies might be there in the first place. When we're thinking about fire, quite honestly, I think a lot of that soil moisture buffers the heat impact, and therefore fire is a secondary thing where really the soil saturation and nutrient stress is what's driving the system. Like I said, beavers are ecosystem engineers, and they also shift the nutrient dynamics quite a bit, perhaps in the other direction. And so with beavers damming up this discharge, they create ponding, which increases the silt and organic matter. Also, there's flux in the water table, which increases the nutrients on the other end of the gradient. And so when you get these conditions, you get a different state and these general emergent wetland plants. And so this kind of has helped us kind of figure out what our state and transition models are. And we've got 3 different phases. Essentially an open fen, which this is the representative species. Orange coneflower is one of these that we found it in every one of our fens. A second phase is our closed fin. Now, these are really small sites in which there's canopy, which doesn't allow for the open fin community to exist. And then the marsh fin is this interactions with beavers. Essentially, you have the karst fin species, but then these emergent species that exist as well. And so that's the reference condition. And there's other states as well as impacted fins, degraded fins, and those that we find in agriculture. And we've kind of highlighted the connections that degrade these sites, but then also hopefully highlighted maybe some marks in which we can restore or conserve these into the future. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea of how karst fins fit within the Ozark Highlands and how they truly are perhaps another karst feature within this complex landscape. And so I'm just kind of zoom out from more of a, say, a watershed level and kind of re-hit some of these things. We have this geological lithology of these different units and these fractures, along with this interstitial karst porosity. And so that's where you start to see these superficial karst features, including fins, along with these other features, and how the groundwater works across the landscape. And so really fins are part of this Ozark forest community, along with woodlands, glades, and upland forests. And when you smash all this together, you get a crazy profile that looks something like this. And so that gives you an idea of how the Ozark Highland karst setting works. But then when we think about the national context, there's some similar communities next door as well, with the central interior seepage fins, as well as the southern ridge and valley seepage fins. These descriptions read very similarly to what we have. And so it might be an opportunity to do some future research and collaborate in describing very similar communities. And so I appreciate everybody's time. This has brought a light, hopefully this ESD, this development has brought a light to an overlooked community. We formalized it through a recognized format and system so it can be carried over, and hopefully a good reference for future conservation efforts and a launch point for additional research and collaboration. So there's a lot of folks that have contributed as we've gone through this ESD development. I want to say thanks to them. And then I just want to say thanks for your interest today, and hopefully you have a few questions. So thank you again for the time.
Thanks, Frank. Excellent presentation. And we've got basically a minute or two here for any other questions. I posed a question on chat regarding other programs and their outlook, or basically looking at the role of beavers in seepage communities. We struggle with the role of beavers here in Missouri. They're both part of the ecosystem, and historically we're an important ecosystem engineer. On the other hand, with so few seepage communities left due to land use changes and other detrimental impacts, sometimes we've struggled with the role of beavers in some of these preserves, such as at Grasshopper Hollow, in terms of beavers impounding areas of rare plant species, which historically would have been a fine landscape feature, but now with so few fens left, we sometimes struggle with their role. I'm curious if other states have dealt with that.
Yeah, good question. And that was actually one of the interesting things with those other community types, was that in those descriptions, they highlight that there is a dynamic with beavers in these seepage fins elsewhere. And so it was one of those concepts that we were kind of struggling with a little bit. And it was good to hear that that is the case in some of these other places.
Yeah, I think we can probably talk about that a little more later on our open discussion about the role of beavers. I'm sure that, and I've got another post here about changes in rainfall intensity too, which certainly is impacting us. Those are great questions. I think I'll table those, and we'll circle around back to those during the open discussion. Right now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. John Evans, who is a professor of biology at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. And his research in plant ecology focuses on plant population dynamics and the processes that determine the composition and structure of these communities over time and across landscapes. He has also studied land use history and exotic species introduction as drivers of long-term ecological change. Much of his work has been concentrated on the Cumberland Plateau and the coastal barrier islands in the Southeast US. And he's also in charge of the herbarium at the University of the South. And so Dr. Evans' talk is, why are the trees disappearing from Sinking Pond on the Arnold Air Force Base, which will be another insight into karst dynamics and also global change patterns.
All right, well, thank you all for inviting me here today to speak. I'm going to be following up on the themes of groundwater and karst. I'm going to present a case study of a fascinating natural area here in Middle Tennessee that is undergoing a major ecological shift and discuss the management implications of this. For the last 20 years, I've been collaborating with U.S. Geological Service, the hydrology lab there in Nashville, looking at the long-term forest dynamics of a seasonally ponded karst depressional wetland called Sinking Pond. And I can get it's located here in Middle Tennessee in that karst region that Frank referred to that was adjacent to his in the northern, the Highland Rim area there adjacent to the Cumberland Plateau. Arnold Air Force Base is there near the town of Tullahoma. You can see here, this is the Air Force Base. The study area where the pond is located is up here in the northern part of the base. It's a 35-hectare pond. And it's part of a assemblage of sinkhole ponds that are located in this area. It's the largest one there. And it's a registered natural landmark on the Air Force Base. And so it's protected by their resource management team there. It's been under conservation for a long time, and it has, as I'll be discussing, some unique biodiversity associated with it. What makes it fascinating is the fact that it holds a heck of a lot of water, and then that water magically drains out over a period of 1 to 2 days, and so much so, and in terms of the rate of water disappearance, that it actually creates a drainage channel within the pond. The pond itself is, as I said, is a karst depressional wetland. So basically, it fills up when the water table is high. The water table prevents the water from draining out, and so surface water fills up the pond. But then, and looks like this when the pond is full, and it's usually it's full from the winter months, January, all the way through until about now. And then around August or so in a typical year, when the water table drops sufficiently, the water is able to drain out of the pond, resulting in an emptying of the system. And you can see the staining on the trees there represents sort of the water level. And so wherever you're standing in this 35-hectare wetland, you can see where the water, where the pond was filled at by this discoloration on the trees. Quite fascinating. So here's a contrast of the two times of year. So basically spring comes to Sinking Pond, as I said, in late summer, early fall, and it lasts until around December or so, and into January either when the first frost hits or when the pond fills up with water again. So it's a very brief growing season, and that's going to factor in an important way later on in this talk. This natural area is important for a number of reasons. It's been given a preliminary designation of G1 by the Nature Conservancy because it has this unique assemblage of plants. It's the only place in the world where overcup oak, river birch, and the resurrection fern are found together. It's also, being an ephemeral wetland, it's very important for herpafauna, things like marbled and spotted tiger salamanders. It's also one of the second largest blue heron rookery in the state. There's a large population of snapping turtles that has set up residence in the pond. They feed on the siblicide that takes place with the heron rookery. The herons throw a sib out of the nest, and the snapping turtles are there to take advantage of that. This is a sort of picture of the trees where this heron rookery is associated here in these overcup oaks. The overcup oak population is the overcup oak is the dominant species in the pond. There's also willow oak and also sweet gum, and those three species make up the vast majority of the canopy. Overcup oak making up more than 80% of it. The overcup oak as a species is characterized by a number of adaptations that make it sort of specially able to survive in basically it's a vertical floodplain you have here. This is a typical coastal plain species found again over on the Mississippi floodplain, and so it has adaptations associated with floodplain trees, things like floating acorns that can remain dormant and submerged. The adults have the ability to survive up to 40% of the growing season in an extreme flooded condition, and the seedlings are quite shade tolerant, which is unusual for oaks. Here's showing the acorns floating here. One of the things that was fascinating to us when we started looking at this natural area was the fact that there seemed to be no regeneration of the overcup oak dominant canopy. There was very few saplings, very few small adults. And so if you look through the forest, while it can be quite dense in some places, there really are no young individuals or small individuals that you typically find, say, in a forest understory. And there could be a number of reasons for that. We published that work back in 2000 when we first started the study, and we set up a long-term study plot in order to track over 20 years what might be contributing to this lack of regeneration, with the possibility at that time pointing to climate change, which wasn't really on a lot of people's radar screens at that point. But we felt that this was a possibility along with others that we needed to rule out. But we set up this long-term plot, about 2.3 hectares, where we mapped every seedling, sapling, and adult in this area. And what you're seeing here on the screen is basically the plot was superimposed over a variety of depths within the pond. So the deepest area there, you can see that drainage channel going to the from right to left. That is over 2 meters deep, and it drains down a sinkhole, which is slightly off the side of the plot there. And so as you go from the top of the plot to the either edge, it gets shallower and shallower. And so we have a wide range of depth as represented by the plot, and helped us to understand the role that hydrology might be playing. So this gives you a sense of how this plot looks. We were able to set up the grid system in which we census the trees by using these temporary transect lines with poles that you can flip. Since it's a much open area, you wouldn't be able to do this in a normal forest, but we were able to use this by initially establishing monuments and then stretching tapes and using these poles, and able to track to a very high degree of accuracy exact locations of everything in this area. And so let's take a look at some of what we found. One of the fascinating things, you look at the tree cover, it covers, and again, if you look at the top of this, we're going to see a number of these graphs here. You remember that the top part of the plot has the depth, the deep areas of the pond, and it gets shallower and shallower as you go down toward the bottom. The adult trees, as represented by the red dots, the different size dots being different size trees, are found throughout the entire plot, okay? And then what's superimposed on here is the distribution of seedlings, which are basically 1 to 3 year old individuals less than 0.5 meters tall. And they're found in discrete patches, typically underneath the trees in which the seeds were born. And they're also found throughout the plot. So adults and seedlings are found throughout the entire plot. And then in terms of saplings, which is what seedlings transition into, what we found was that they tend to be associated with places where site topography, shallow water, and light gaps interact, and then you find these in discrete clumps. And here you can see there's sort of a dome of saplings located within the pond, but they're only found currently in the shallow areas of the pond. They do come up in the deep areas. Here's an area that was where saplings came up in a deep area back in 2010, but they all died, so they don't last. Here you can see seedlings submerged underwater. So if you look at the distribution of these different life history states, seedlings, saplings, large saplings, and adults, one of the fascinating things is and this is in 2001, and again, we recensused this in 2018, the 2 years are pretty much identical. So either year you can focus on here. This, as I said before, the seedlings tend to map the distribution of adults, but saplings are limited only to a discrete area, and then they only recruit even more specifically in that discrete area, and that's the shallow part, less than 0.5 meter deep water within the pond. There's no current sapling regeneration in the deeper areas of the pond at all. And you can see that's reinforced 20 years later. There's been no recruitment over that 20-year period of individuals through that, what seems to be a vulnerable life history state. Willow oak, which is the second most common species in the pond, has pretty much an identical pattern. Here you can see the seedlings sort of mapping with the adults, and then the saplings really just restricted to this shallow area within the pond. There's been quite a bit more mortality of willow oaks than in overcup oak. Both trees live to be a long time, but willow oak adults seem to be dying out at a much higher rate. So what do we have? We have no saplings that have grown taller than 0.5 meters in the deep part of the pond since, turns out, with aging all our aging a sample of our adult trees, we know that there's been no recruitment since the 1960s. And so we have this interesting phenomenon then of regeneration failure as a function of water depth. And the question then that's begged by all this is why? Well, there's a number of things we had to eliminate before we could jump to the sort of the big overarching possibility of climate change, the possibility that deer might be limiting sapling recruitment. Of course, that happens all across the eastern United States as natural area managers. You all know that. It's easy to rule that out with the exclosures, and we did. There wasn't any effect when exclosures were put up within the pond. There's another fascinating possibility that soil erosion could have led to a clogging of the drain, which is not too likely, but with major land use, that could represent a possibility, particularly since in the 1940s, the Air Force Base was used by General Patton to do tank training. And so there was quite a bit of disturbance in that area. We did a large GIS land use study of the area in and around the pond. And we showed that basically the pond retained its forest cover during a 30, 40 decade period. And so that this is our plot here. And that it's not likely at all that any land use that was occurring outside of that area would have had any major erosional effect such that it would have affected the drain. And my hydrology colleagues concurred with that. The final one, which we thought was probably the smoking gun, was reservoir creation. The Arnold Air Force Base, they test rocket engines, and so they need water to cool their rocket engines. And so they created this reservoir on the Elk River, and they pump water up to this reservoir here, this small reservoir, which is near Sinking Pond. And so we thought, okay, wow, so that could be, they started doing that, back in the 1960s. Could this be the culprit when they started pumping water up here? That changed the hydro period of this pond. Well, the hydrological studies that my colleagues in Nashville conducted indicated there was no hydrological connection that could have resulted in that as a possibility. So we could rule that one out. Well, that just leaves then the possibility of climate change. Now we think of climate change, we think of global warming, but climate is both temperature and precipitation. And the precipitation side of climate change is really what's affecting the Southern Appalachians and this part of Tennessee more than anything. There's no real temperature signature yet, but there's clearly a precipitation signature. If you look at the last, 20, 30 years, you can see there's this shift of increased precipitation such that since 1990, the average rainfall is significantly more than the previous 40 years. And so that's that seems to be playing out throughout this region as our sort of the thing that's going to be most likely associated in this century with climate change as it affects natural areas. And so what does that mean in terms of as a driver for what's happening in this pond? Well, part of what we had to do in order to get more accurate understanding of this was to create a hydrological model and we use our 20 years of data from the well data at the pond, as well as the work that had been done prior to that. This is actually, you can go there today. This is the well that's there in Sinking Pond. You can see that currently it's just starting to drain out here at the end of August. It filled up by January 1st. So it's been full pretty much since January 1st this past year. But some years it never drains at all. And in other years, it stays dry the entire year. And what this graph summarizes, if you look at the top part here, each of these bars represents a year in which the pond this represents the elevation at which the pond stayed full for 200 days, or 210 days, 220 days, 230 days, 240 days. And what this basically tells us is where are the windows of opportunity that could have occurred in the past. And so we have actual data starting from 1990s forward, but my hydrology colleagues simulated based on rainfall records what was happening in the past. And we were able to then superimpose on this graph the ages of trees. And you can see there are clusters of trees that were, these are trees that are adults that are in the canopy, and they were recruited in different periods of time in the past. There hasn't been anything that's been recruited into the canopy in the deeper part of the pond. These are the elevations that are going to be below 323 or 324 actually. So these all represent recruitment that occurred throughout the pond, including the deep areas. You can see there's been no recruitment in the shallow areas, throughout the pond, except for in the shallow area as represented by this cluster here. Bottom line from this graph is that what's happened is that you've had this increased frequency of days in which the pond stays full. And it seems to be just enough such that the windows of opportunity now are shut down for the recruitment of overcup oak in this pond, which wasn't the case in the past. And so what does this mean in terms of management implications? Well, this is a pond that is, it was probably at its tipping point. Typically in a disturbed system, there's a great deal of resiliency over time that has evolved in that system, like with flooding system, where trees can respond to flooding and then bounce back and maintain populations. This was probably a system that was at a tipping point. In other words, these trees were pretty marginally able to maintain this canopy, and then with this just enough increase in rainfall, you have an ecosystem state change. And what does this mean then for management implications? Well, you have, this is an unusual situation. It's probably the first example of where climate change in an interior state here in this region has pushed the system past a tipping point. If you remove the overcup oak canopy, of course, you're going to remove the great blue heron rookery. That's going to affect the food for the snapping turtles. It's going to unwind the assemblage of these unique trees that are associated. Obviously, changing the hydroperiod affects the herpofauna as well. And so with any sort of state change in an ecosystem comes a whole unraveling of ecosystem dynamics and has consequences. From the standpoint of the management at the Arnold Air Force Base, there's really not a whole lot that they can do since it is indeed climate change. And so the long-term consequences for them from a management scenario don't look good. I mean, they're basically going to have to live with this going forward. Looks like I'm here at the end of my time. I'm going to answer questions, but before I do that, I just want to acknowledge my colleagues at the U.S. Geological Survey, Bill Wolf and Jennifer Cartwright. Also my students and former students who worked with me on this project over the years. The funding has been generously provided by the Air Force and by USGS.
I was a little confused on the shade tolerance of Quercus lyrate. I think is it shade tolerant?
And the seedlings are. I mean, in terms of the no, I guess that, yeah, it's better characterized as like most oaks, in that, you know, at a certain point they're going to be somewhat gap dependent for recruitment. What's interesting though is that they can survive with very little carbon accumulation, because they can live underwater. And, you know, they can basically survive on root reserves or cotyledon reserves, even if over a year in which the water doesn't even drain out. So it's not so much shade tolerance as much as juveniles, they're quite tolerant of not having a whole lot of carbon acquisition within a given year. But that only lasts for so long, and then they basically run out of those reserves. But no, in terms of normal gap dynamics, I would say they're more typical of oaks, in that they're they're somewhat shade intolerant as in that later transitions.
Are there any other species recruiting into that advanced, more inundated hydrology?
No, there are not. And I think that speaks to the fact that overcup oak probably is, other than cypress, which isn't in this area, is probably the only thing that could survive, you know, even at the prior sort of hydrological set of conditions. But no, it's basically becoming an open wetland, and it's already looking very much like that. Although these trees live a long time. That's one of the reasons why we needed this 20-year period of understanding, because, you know, obviously to get a signature for climate change, you can't just look at any one, you know, even one decade. You need to have long-term record in order to really, you know, pin that down. But it seems to be the case that this has reached a point of no return in terms of recruitment.
Let's see, there's a question here. Has creating more canopy gaps for the saplings at the higher elevations been considered to increase the longevity of these trees on site?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that around the edges of the pond, in the more shallow areas, there's probably a likelihood that overcup oak will persist. It's not a very good competitor, however, in these shallower depths. And so my guess is that over time, it's not so much light as much as it's just, you know, it's kind of like someone with a scuba diving outfit. They're really very competitive underwater. You're going to do a wrestling match, but you put that person up on land, they're not going to be able to wrestle very effectively with you. And I think that's in these shallower areas. I think you can't be a jack of all trades. And I think what you're going to see over time is that, you know, there's a reason why overcup oak distribution doesn't continue beyond the pond. It's just not a very good competitor with or without, you know, light gaps.
Have any fish been able to persist in that pond?
That's a great question. No, there are no fish right now. At some point, though, you know, if you get 2 or 3 years that you know, back up where the pond doesn't drain out, it's possible that fish populations could start to show up. And of course, once that happens, that's a whole different kind of dynamic in terms of predation on amphibian larvae and such, and there's a whole nother set of implications in terms of ecosystem unraveling there, but not yet, no.
Let's see, we've got one more question here about submergent aquatics beginning to become established in those wetland.
Yeah, that's a good question. No, not. It's pretty much just litter and temporarily established seedlings of overcup oak that you find in the deep area, and that's pretty much all. There's nothing else there. The question about, is it open to the general public? Yes, it is. They were doing some logging there in order to open up the nearby runway to improve the jet access, and they closed it down during that period. But it's back open again. Yeah, there's a sign right off of Interstate 24. Just follow the directions on it.
Great. Well, thanks so much. That's fascinating. And I remember going there on a field trip during the Natural Areas Conference that was held in Nashville. So
yeah, good
to hear about that site again.
Thanks, Don.
Well, now I think we'll go ahead and shift gears to the stewardship shorts, and we'll go ahead and pass this over to Lisa.
Thanks. Thanks to you both. John, yeah, Mike, I was thinking about that very same field trip at the Nashville conference in 2008. That's when some of us visited Sinking Pond. Wonderful. Well, as Mike mentioned a little earlier, we have, this isn't, it's a little bit of a spin on an element to the roundtables we got started this past winter, the stewardship shorts. These are 5-minute pre-recorded videos related to the topic at hand that describes a project, methodology, best practice, or challenge that you as practitioners are facing. These are 5-minute video presentations, and there'll be 5 minutes for Q&A following each video. We've got 3 of them. And fortunately, we have all 3 presenters of these videos on the roundtable today. So they'll be joining in and facilitating the Q&A. And at that time, I'll mention again, feel free to turn your video on if you have a question. We'll try to manage that. Okay, the first stewardship short is by Jason Miller. Jason's with the Natural Areas Program. He's the Natural Areas Program Manager for the Tennessee Natural Areas Program, Division of Natural Areas. And the title for his video is Haggard Tract Restoration at the Prairie State Natural Area.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. This is Jason Miller with the Tennessee Division of Natural Areas, and I want to discuss an ongoing restoration project we've got that's located just a mile or 2 from a site discussed earlier. Prairie State Natural Area is located in pretty close proximity to the Sinking Pond Natural Area that was presented on previously. Now, Prairie itself is about a 500-acre site on the eastern Highland Rim, but it contains our largest and most intact relict eastern Highland Rim wet prairie in Tennessee. It's probably the most significant botanical site in the state. And the Haggard Tract restoration is not on the prairie itself, but on an adjacent management unit located next to the prairie. So to kind of get a sense for what we're doing at Prairie, I wanted to start with some historic aerial imagery. This crescent-shaped feature here is what we currently call Prairie. If you look at this image, you can see that it used to extend pretty far to the north and to the west from where it lies currently. But if you bump up a couple decades into the 60s, you can see that far northwestern section of the prairie had started to close in pretty well. The red arrows on these images sort of represent what we refer to as the Haggard Tract historically. So you can see, looking back into the 40s, that there was an open condition in this area. By the 60s, that had closed in almost entirely, and we started to see a little bit of development in the area. By the late 70s, you can see it was once again cleared entirely, and that development along its periphery had really picked up some steam. By 2012, we kind of got into the condition that we see today with some pretty hard edges where the site had just been treated as an ag field for a number of decades. Here we are looking a little bit closer at that imagery from the 1970s, and you can still make out the prairie, still open, but just looking a little bit closer at the Haggard Tract, you can see some of the alteration that had been completed on the site. You see a pretty distinct straight line where the former stream had been channelized, and you also see these sort of perpendicular grooves cut across the Haggard Tract. And the reason for that was that the previous owner, the Haggard family, had tried to convert this into row crops. So with it being, naturally a wet prairie system, it was just a little bit too wet to grow crops on, and so they tried to drain that. Over time, they eventually figured out that that wasn't going to work. The site remained too wet, so they converted it in its entirety into a fescue field to try and run cattle on it. The site remained in fescue up until about the mid-1990s when the state acquired it from the Haggard family, and restoration efforts began at that time, first with the application of herbicide to remove fescue from the field, and then repeated prescribed fires to try and keep the woodies at bay until native herbaceous species repopulated the area. This had some limited success, but it was about 2012 when a large-scale stream restoration project was implemented that really brought the site back. You can see in these images where the banks were laid back and channelization was removed from the stream. If you look at the red arrows below on the images, you can see where sinuosity was restored to the stream. It sort of meanders through the Haggard Tract now. And then additionally, the perpendicular ditches I noted earlier have been disconnected from the stream channel. This increases residence time of water in the Haggard Tract so that it's restored to a more wet prairie type condition that would have naturally occurred in the area. Another major step to restoring the Haggard Tract was reseeding the site with native vegetation from May Prairie. These images illustrate that effort, with hay being cut on the prairie proper, hay bales being redistributed over the Haggard Tract, which, as you can see in this image, was pretty much just a mowed field at that time. The lower image represents what the site looks like today. You can see it's much more diverse than the fescue patch it was previously. Having just visited the site last week, results are very encouraging. We saw a pretty great bloom of Platanthera nivea, which was previously only known from May Prairie itself in the entire state of Tennessee. It's a state endangered species. We've also seen the state threatened Eryngium integrifolium and a pretty rare milkweed, Asclepias hurtella, on the site. Overall, we'd have to say that both the seeding and the hydraulic restoration have been a huge success on the Haggard Tract. I'll be happy to take any of your questions.
I'll just make a quick mention that Dr. Evans's illustration earlier of increased rainfall, going from the 40s onward, probably accounted for some of the closing in of the periphery of the prairie. Besides just fire exclusion and lack of grazing, I think that increased rainfall in the area probably played a pretty big role in that site closing in over time.
Okay. Mike, you want to turn your video on and ask Jason your question?
Oh yeah, I was just curious, Jason, if prairie cordgrass, Spartina pectinata, is a dominant component of that system, or if it's not present on the site.
Good question for one of the botanists. I know there's Spartina grass out there. I don't know which species are, currently dominating.
Yeah, because we've done kind of hay mulch areas to restore wet prairie here in the Midwest, and with varying degrees of success, because the Spartina doesn't always, it produces seed, but a weevil really eats the seed a lot. So I was just a little bit curious.
Yeah, I mean, big blue stem pretty much dominates, but it's pretty diverse.
Great.
Jason, am I understanding right that those rare species you showed, the Platanthera and the other two, are on this restored tract, or are they just in the original prairie across the way?
That's correct. They're on this restored tract, and we only started seeing those in the last 2 years. So we had a couple years of pretty good response once we did that initial work, but then we really fought a lot of woodies the last few years, in particular sweet gum in one section that seemed to be drying some areas out. And once we really battled that stuff back, we started seeing some of these rare elements showing up.
Wow, thanks.
Excellent. Anybody else want to jump on, turn the video on and ask questions? All right, very good. Jason, thank you so much. That was excellent. And another beautiful natural area that we highlighted at the Natural Areas Conference in 2008. So thank you for that. Okay, great. Our next video is a little longer than 5 minutes. And it's being presented by Theo Witzel and Dustin Lynch, who you just saw. Theo's an ecologist and chief of research and the curator of the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission's herbarium. And Dustin Lynch is an aquatic ecologist with the same program, and they are going to present the conservation of groundwater, stream biodiversity in Northwest Arkansas. Thanks, guys.
I'm Theo Witzel, ecologist and chief of research for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission.
And I'm Dustin Lynch, aquatic ecologist for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission.
We're going to tag team a presentation to tell you about conservation of groundwater stream biodiversity at 2 sites in Northwest Arkansas. Northwest Arkansas, and in particular 2 counties, Benton and Washington, the 2 northwesternmost counties of the state, is one of the fastest developing regions in the country. For the last 10 years, they've been adding on average about 1,000 people per month to this region. It's in the Ozark Highlands. And in particular, we're going to tell you about two ecoregions in that area, the Springfield Plateau and the dissected Springfield Plateau. Next slide. The Springfield Plateau is sort of the more gentle terrain in Northwest Arkansas. It's a flat to gently rolling karst plain. And the dissected Springfield Plateau is a lower elevation, more dissected portion of that same land surface. Historically, this area was largely grassland. There was more than 70,000 acres of treeless tallgrass prairie mapped in the original land survey in this area, but much of the balance of that Springfield Plateau was open savanna and open woodland. So it was very sparsely wooded. And also, as the name implies, the Springfield Plateau was rich in groundwater. There's lots of springs, seeps, historically open fens. And in both the grasslands and these groundwater features are all critically imperiled in the region and have all declined. And the remnants that we have of those are rich in rare biodiversity, and they're a top conservation priority. Next slide.
This part of the state is actually home to two of the rarest fish species in Arkansas, the Arkansas darter, Ethiostoma cragini, and the least darter, Ethiostoma microperca. And what's somewhat unusual about these fish is that they are heavily associated with these open woodland, savanna, and prairie habitats. There are over 200 darter species in North America, mostly in the southeast part of the country. We don't typically think of them as prairie associated, but that is the case with these two fish. These are species that in Arkansas are restricted to an area of about 140 square miles, and every known occurrence is either in or near this rapidly urbanizing area. The Arkansas darter, Ethiostoma cragini, is not actually named for the state of Arkansas. That's kind of a misnomer. It was named for the Arkansas River Basin. And if you look at this range map, it's really a Great Plains species, with most of its range being in Kansas and eastern Colorado. There's only a small area of the country where it overlaps with the next species, the least darter, Ethiostoma microperca, with that being kind of the area around northwest Arkansas and northeast Oklahoma. The least darter, as the name implies, is a very small fish. It's actually one of the smallest species in North America, and it is the smallest native fish in Arkansas. And the two of them really require aquatic vegetation that's facilitated by this open canopy stream habitat. This map, again, shows this area of mapped tallgrass prairie that historically was in northwest Arkansas, along with that white portion on the map, which is savanna and open woodland. So you can see that plotted against all known occurrences of Arkansas and least darter in the state, and that there's a pretty tight correlation. That is where these species were historically. And in fact, if you look at some of those prairies, they're pretty tightly correlated with some of these populations of darters. So we're going to focus on one in particular.
This is a historical prairie area that we call Clabber Creek Prairie, so named for the creek that flows through the middle of it. And historically, it was wet prairie. You can see pimple mounds in this photograph. That's a characteristic of those seasonally wet hardpan clay prairies that we have. And the yellow dots are known occurrences of Arkansas darter. This area, as I mentioned, is developing very rapidly. This is on the north side of the city of Fayetteville. And this is what it looked like in 1995. It was still rural, mostly open, lots of hayfields and pastures. And in just 25 years, we've seen a massive changes in this area. Next slide. This is it 25 years later. Much of it's lost to dense urban development. And then the balance that's no longer still being managed as hayfields or pastures has grown up in woody vegetation. It's no longer open grassland. Next slide. Fortunately, there is a natural preserve in that area, the Wilson Springs Preserve, which is managed by the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust. And again, you can see the occurrences of Arkansas darter within the preserve. Next slide. But even this preserve has changed dramatically in the last 25 years. Before it was actually protected, it was largely open. There was some savanna in the lower right of the photo of the preserve in the photo, and then the balance was mostly open pasture or hayfield. And then, of course, there was some wooded areas. The blue area is the spring run, which emerges from under the interstate exchange and runs into Clabber Creek. Next slide. Just 15 years later, though, things had changed dramatically. The site had been protected, and that meant no longer was being managed. And in that time, it grew up almost entirely in woody vegetation, from shrubs to small trees, choking out mostly the whole place. Next slide. Fortunately, the Land Trust began a process of habitat restoration and management, where they went in and thinned the canopy, especially along the spring runs at first, and later spread throughout most of the area, and also removed a lot of the woody shrub layer that was very dense, including a number of non-native species of trees and shrubs. Next slide. And that management on the ground made a huge difference. Here you can see the spring run is cleared of woody vegetation. You can see some stumps in the background from larger trees that were removed. And you can see this dense grassland-derived herbaceous layer of sedges, rushes, grasses, and forbs. And that little spring run there is the spring run where the Arkansas darter is found. It's very small, you could step across it. This is the first site in the state where Arkansas darter was found, and the first one protected for that species. Next slide. The management is really night and day on the ground in there. This is on the left, unmanaged, and on the right of the spring run, managed, removed the shrub layer. You can see some old open grown oaks, remnants of the old savanna in the background. Next slide. The Land Trust also contracted out with a forestry mulcher or timber grinder to come in and chew up a lot of the smaller woody vegetation. And over time, that has responded dramatically with, as you saw in the couple slides previous. Next. There's also some rare terrestrial wetland habitats that are spring fed on the site, like our best example of a prairie fen habitat left in Northwest Arkansas is in this preserve. And there's a couple shots from that. You can see some of the plants. Next slide. Many of the species in the fen there, plants are rare or uncommon. Some are rare, tracked by the Heritage Program. Others are just rare in the region, maybe more common in the Gulf Coastal Plain or some other ecoregion. Next slide.
Another extremely important site in this area is Healing Springs Natural Area. This is an 84.5 acre preserve, and this is one of the newest natural areas in the Heritage Commission's system of natural areas. This is a really important site because it's one of the best remaining sites for both the Arkansas and leased darter. So there are a few sites that have just Arkansas, a few that have just leased, and only a couple that have both species, and this is the best for both of them. As you can see, it's got this characteristic, really open canopy habitat with lots of aquatic vegetation. And this place has a really interesting history when it comes to land use. So at one point, this was an exotic animal farm. There were things like European red deer there, and then later it became a llama farm. And then eventually it was heavily kind of overgrazed by cattle. So that history of grazing has heavily impacted the terrestrial communities there and the plants in particular. But ironically, it probably facilitated keeping this canopy open, which has allowed these two rare darters to persist. This is an aerial photo of the property. The history of this place in terms of acquisition is the Heritage Commission got this with the help of the Arkansas Department of Transportation, who actually needed it as a stream mitigation site for a project they were doing in that same watershed. The pasture areas are in the process of being restored now to more of a historic tallgrass prairie community that would have been there. This collage just shows different parts of the natural area and what some of the different habitats there look like. Again, open canopy, lots of aquatic vegetation, and the two darter species don't fully inhabit every part of both spring runs that are at this natural area, but even the parts that don't have those two species, again, the Arkansas and leased darter pictured here, contain many other interesting and rare aquatic species. So the natural area is actually home to several other tract fish species, and these are all fairly rare regional endemics, things like the sunburst darter, the newly described plateau darter, and this large minnow, the red spot chub, which are all found in the natural area. It's also got some really interesting rare and tract crayfish species. So there are two fairly narrow range endemic stream dwelling crayfish, the midget crayfish and meek short pointed crayfish, that are both confined to the Illinois River watershed. And then this really interesting primary burrowing species, the Osage burrowing crayfish, which is heavily associated with historical wet prairies and savanna habitats. That's also found on the property. It's also found in the recharge zone of a spring nearby that has a population of Ozark cavefish. This is a federally listed species that's obviously a cave obligate and heavily impacted by rapid urban development in the area.
The terrestrial natural communities at this site are heavily altered. It's probably the least intact flora of any natural area in the system. However, we're looking at that as a real opportunity for restoration, and there's some wonderful old open grown remnant savanna trees there that really are a testament to what the character of this landscape would have been like historically. Old bur oaks and chinkapin oaks, which are characteristic species of these calcareous savannas in the region. Next slide. And this is, these projects are all very much collaborative efforts with a lot of different conservation partners active in Northwest Arkansas. Monitoring of and locating these rare species, aquatic species, has been ongoing with the Game and Fish Commission. And there's all these agencies and nonprofits that have worked together to do conservation on these sites. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. We have a question from Alex Voznitsa. The question is, have you observed any negative correlation between surface water runoff and darter populations in the creek? Dustin.
We haven't really studied that intensively. A lot of these sites, these two we have access to, but a lot of the other populations are on private property. We only have sporadic access to them, but that would be something to look at. We have some researchers in the state now who are going to be doing several projects at Healing Springs. I just took them up there last week, so I think that might be something that they look at.
Yeah, I was just curious if the darters in those systems, are they sort of, endemics there as a an artifact of like thermal refugia, being near springs, and then with the open condition, getting lots of sunlight warming that water, is that sort of a limiting factor for them upstream and downstream? Is that why they're kind of confined to that area?
Part of the reason, it's substrate and canopy both. So as you go up towards the actual springs, on both of those spring runs at Healing Springs, for example, you have more of a closed canopy, but you also have less fine sediment. So it's more cobbly and gravelly. And there are other darters that you find instead of those two species, things like fantail darter, which aren't much in the part that has the other two species, but is pretty common as you go up. As far as refugia, it's just that they have such a specific habitat requirement, and it's that combination of open canopy and spring. Like as you go south towards the Boston Mountain, you just don't have that kind of habitat, and there are other different darters that live there. One thing I didn't have time to touch on is that these populations, for the least darter especially, but both species, are really, really divergent genetically from other known populations. That least darter in Northwest Arkansas is divergent enough to almost be considered a species, and there has been work done on that. So really unique, really important populations there.
Ryan, you want to pop back on? I think you've got a couple of questions.
Sure. Can you hear me, Lisa?
Sure can.
I was just thinking back towards Jason's short, and kind of had a question, not necessarily just for Jason, but for everyone on this call. I was thinking about the kind of stream morphology work that was done to re-meander that stream, and thinking about preserves that I manage where such work might make sense. But one question I often encounter among my colleagues and with myself is, what amount of a watershed or what stretch of a reach of a stream do you think needs to be protected for that morphology work to be worthwhile, to be logical, to be sustainable? In other words, you imagine a certain reach of stream, how much of that do you need control over for such an undertaking that can be very expensive to really be worth it? And I was curious, either Jason's thoughts or anybody else on this call that perhaps has dealt with a similar situation.
Well, I would say two things. We're very near at that site, specifically very near the headwaters where that water first comes above ground, where that restoration work was completed. So it's the very upper reaches of the stream. And then very quickly after that, you sort of run into a bunch of really developed areas. So that sort of took care of like the most upper reaches of it. So it seemed worthwhile to do from that end. The other side of it financially is that work was done at no cost to us as mitigation for some impacts elsewhere in the watershed. So we were able to get that work done for free. And because of, the abnormally dry conditions in the Haggard tract, it just seemed worthwhile, to kind of try to make that site wetter And with that being a means to do it, it just made some sense to us. In terms of like, how much would be worthwhile in comparison to an overall watershed? Yeah, that's a good question for some hydrologist somewhere, I think.
Yeah, Ryan, there's an article, and I'll have to dig it out. I'm sure there's been more research done since then. This has been a few years ago, but there was a paper that looked at what percent of the watershed in impervious surface, I mean, in terms of just concrete, was a tipping point for aquatic biota. And it was something around 10%. Like once you reached over 10% of a watershed is where you had significant negative impacts. But I'll have to dig that out. I'm sure there's been more work since then, but it was interesting because it tried to quantify that question.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in here. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think when Jason was saying, if you're further up in that watershed, you have better chances of success. I know, like in Missouri, we've got like Pershing State Park is the only unchannelized portion of that reach, and we're dealing with water all the way from Iowa coming down, and just it's inundated with sediment. And so the further down in a watershed you go, the more challenging it gets because you're dealing with stuff off site. So yeah, I don't think there's a clear answer, but yeah, further up in the watershed, the higher chances of success when you're doing that kind of stream restoration, just because of scale issues.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. And we will have time here at the end of the roundtable in case something does come to your mind. Wonderful. The next and final stewardship short that we have for you is presented by Ryan Klopf, who you just got a glimpse of. Ryan is the regional supervisor and mountain region steward for the natural area science coordinator for the Virginia Natural Heritage Program. And the title of his presentation is Ecological Restoration of a Shenandoah Valley Sinkhole Pond. Thank you, Ryan.
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Clough, and I work for the Virginia Natural Heritage Program as a regional steward and supervisor within our stewardship section. I also serve as the Natural Areas Science Coordinator for our program. This afternoon, for my stewardship short, I'll be sharing with you just a little bit about an ongoing restoration of a Shenandoah Valley sinkhole pond within Mount Joy Pond Natural Area Preserve in Western Virginia. Sinkhole ponds are found throughout the western part of Virginia within the Ridge and Valley province. These are relatively old ponds which contain unique assemblages of plant species that are also found in other habitats. These ponds are considered critically imperiled, in part because many of them have been lost to development. Fortunately, several of these ponds have been protected and are actively managed for biodiversity conservation, including Mount Joy Pond Natural Area Preserve, found here just west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. One of the rare species of wildflower found within Mount Joy Pond is shown here, Virginia sneezeweed, Pollinium virginica. A close-up view of Virginia sneezeweed here shows just how beautiful this flower is during its midsummer peak bloom. The sinkhole pond within Mount Joy Pond Natural Area Preserve, where species such as Virginia sneezeweed thrive, has variable periods of flooding and dry periods during which it's dry. This oscillating flooded, dry state appears to be a critical disturbance in creating just the right habitat for species such as Virginia sneezeweed. Stewards that manage this preserve had noticed that over the past decade, it appeared that the pond was flooded less often than in previous years. This observation led to an investigation. Specifically, with help from Virginia Tech, we turned to the aerial historic photograph record and found that over the past half century, older photographs indeed showed the pond more often flooded than recent photographs that showed the pond more often in a dry state, as shown in these two photographs. We also noticed in these photographs something that is common throughout the Shenandoah Valley, which is an increased cover of trees and a reduction of open woodland habitats. More specifically, the Shenandoah Valley in the last century, like many other places, has experienced a century of fire suppression and a resultant shift away from open oak woodlands towards more closed canopy conditions dominated by mesic species such as red maple and white pine. Our hypothesis is that within the Mountjoy Pond watershed, this increase in the cover of white pine and red maple and other music species has resulted in both an increase in the amount of interception of incoming precipitation and associated evaporation of that intercepted precipitation, as well as an increase in transpiration by an increased density of music species such as red maple, which has effectively lowered the shallow water table, thereby reducing the amount of time during which the pond itself is flooded. Our restoration plan was to restore the historic oak woodland community of the Mountjoy Pond watershed through prescribed fire. And we hypothesize that this restoration will change the local evapotranspirative balance, favoring an increased amount of time in a flooded condition in the pond. In order to test that hypothesis, we devised a restoration approach that included prescribed fire, but also the installation of 8 groundwater monitoring wells in partnership with Virginia Tech. These shallow wells will be able to determine the depth to the water table in 8 locations throughout the pond. This photograph shows what the margin of the pond looks like after the first prescribed burn had occurred a few months prior to this photograph being taken. The first prescribed burn of the pond watershed had relatively moderate fire behavior and specifically impacted, as you would expect, species that lack fire adaptation, such as red maple, white pine, and Virginia pine. This photograph of the northern edge of the pond shows the difference in fire effects of a Virginia pine on the right and a fire-adapted pitch pine on the left. This graph shows the data from our wells. At the top, the blue bars represent precipitation, which appears to be constant throughout the study period. The blue bar horizontal in the middle of this figure shows the zero depth, that is the surface of the pond, and the colored bars at the bottom represent depth to groundwater of the different monitoring wells. Prescribed fire occurred at this time, shown by the purple bar here. And one thing we noticed was that about 1 year after the prescribed burn, the pond reached a full flood stage for the first time in the better part of a decade. And while this is just our early preliminary result, and to date only 1 prescribed fire has so far been conducted within this watershed, this is an interesting and encouraging preliminary result. So as we move forward, continue to restore the pond watershed, we will continue to monitor groundwater in the pond. And we look forward to sharing what we learn as we move forward. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
I can't remember, but how deep is the groundwater there? I wasn't looking at your graph close enough. Is it like a perched aquifer there?
Yeah, so there's essentially a clay lens underneath, just about less than 1 meter deep underneath Mountjoy Pond. And so when water comes up through the karst layer that's deeper, in a deeper geologic layer there, overflows the clay lens, which is kind of like an upside down umbrella underground, and then traps the water. And so, yeah, good question, Mike. I have a slide to that effect, but to make the short cutoff, I had to take that one out. Good question. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, Ryan, thank you so much for that. Here we have one from Alex. Can you please remind me the size of the pond, how much vegetation was removed with fire?
Oh, those are good questions too, Alex. Thank you. So the pond itself is about 4 acres. And the watershed, the entire watershed is protected within the preserve. And it's a relatively small watershed. And as far as how much vegetation was removed, we are collecting those data. We have fire effects monitoring plots that do stem counts, basal area, things like that. I don't have that data with me worked up yet today, but that is something that is an important part of this story. What I can tell you is that, as you saw in that photograph, the prescribed burn had very moderate fire behavior. And so only small fire sensitive vegetation was directly impacted. So, but we do have the vegetation monitoring plots in the pond and in the woods surrounding the pond, in the pond's watershed, that'll be able to paint an accurate picture of what's going on with that vegetation. But good question. Thank you. Well,
Right.
I have a question for myself, no, for everybody. But one thing that we would be helpful in this project, and I'm just curious if anybody else out there is doing this, but to have local weather stations on site to collect these data. So relatively inexpensive, movable weather stations. So not anything that would require permanent installation and lots of maintenance. But is anybody out there using a remote weather station to collect some basic data, such as precip, temperature, wind, stuff like that? Just curious.
Well, no, we had a study that our sister agency, Missouri Department of Natural Resources, did, where they set up a number of weather stations on different wetlands. But I don't know how they weren't extremely portable from what I remember.
Right. Those were more permanent weather
Yeah.
stations. And that was, about 6 or 7 locations. Yeah, I'm not sure if where's more what Ryan's talking about in terms of temporary ones.
Well, we've got 15 minutes for open discussion. So if folks want to circle around back to questions with Frank's talk or John's talk or any of the presentations, we've got time for that. And you're probably sick of hearing me talk. So hopefully some other folks will chime in, especially I am curious about other states and programs working with beavers and their impoundment impacts. And then of course, changing rainfall, which is something beyond our control immediately, obviously, is changing the hydrographs of many of our systems. But I'd be curious to hear about other states work on any of these things.
I guess I do have a question in terms of, since we're talking about groundwater, but then also in these fire dominated landscapes, about one of the sites that we were on in terms of the interactions between the two. There was a head fire. We didn't know going into it what had happened, but the fin was a lot drier and didn't realize what had happened until afterwards. A head fire had been used instead of a backfire, and it seemed like it was much more substantial impact to the fin itself, which made us start thinking about these nutrient dynamics. And was curious if other folks are cognizant of how they're burning these wet spots, essentially, in terms of what it might do to the peat layer or the nutrients and the resulting plant species. Well, anyway, it was one of those, being on site is one of those aha moments of going, oh, we might need to treat these things a little bit differently than we are the adjacent upland forest. And so anyway, it'll probably go in our recommendations.
Frank, did the peat catch fire? Did it consume the peat?
No, it did not. Basically, the mosses were smoked. They were pretty brown and weren't in other locations that we had seen that had fire go through. You had some residual grass stems that were consumed, but the mosses themselves will look like they've been pretty much insulated by the moisture. And this site, it was all the moisture was out of the soils itself, and then the mosses were pretty impacted. And so it seemed like that convective heat of that head fire essentially had evaporated all that soil moisture, and therefore it had a bigger impact on the plant species themselves. And so the peat hadn't itself caught fire, but the plants were a lot more impacted, it looked like, than several of the other sites that we had seen that had gone a recent burn.
Asking because a few, maybe 15 years ago now, we had a site in the Gulf Coastal Plain. There was an ancient peat deposit. So there wasn't a peaty wetland there now, but there had been at some point in the past. And we were doing a prescribed burn of some adjacent flatwoods, and it caught the peat layer on fire and burned for weeks and killed a bunch of trees. And it was a big surprise. And it was very
you hear about that going on up in the Boreal, but yeah.
It happened in South Arkansas a few years ago.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting.
I guess this would be a question for folks from Minnesota. Speaking of the Boreal and fire, I assume fire is a natural dynamic there in those vast peatlands you have, where you would have peat fires burning out, and then they would change community dynamics. I'm just curious if I think there were some folks from Minnesota on board. Just curious what the role of fire is up in those peat systems.
Yeah, and this is Judy Schulte with the Minnesota DNR, and Amber Beth, I think, is on too today. I'd say we're not actively using fire on peatlands. It's just a matter of if and when it happens, and I'm not the specialist to really answer those questions for you, unless AB has more insight there. Yeah, I don't know how much we've done as far as researching the effects of that long term.
Yeah, this is Amber Beth, a colleague of Judy's up in northern Minnesota, and we have lots and lots of peatlands, and we don't. In the natural areas program, we're not using fire in them currently. I think probably the only program in our state that might be using some fire would be our wildlife program, especially in the northwest part of the state. But generally for our peatlands, because they do tend to burn a long time and are such big ecosystems here, that we haven't been using fire to manage any of our peatlands.
I'm going to respond to
with the
Mike's
carbon release in those peatlands too. So
responding to Mike's question about beaver, I think that's a really interesting topic. The last year's Natural Areas Association conference, I think there was a great keynote talk on beaver ecology, and that got us really thinking about, well, we've already been thinking about it a lot, but we have a number of groundwater fed wetlands in the Gulf Coastal Plain. So this is southern Arkansas, gravelly sandy uplands, which generate a lot of groundwater downslope. And so there's these seepage fed bottomland systems down there, some of which get impounded by beaver marshes. And there's enough groundwater that it's a constant water level year round in these beaver marshes. And they develop these really interesting, what we call a floatant marsh community. So it's like a really diverse floating mats of essentially wet grassland vegetation. So you can walk out on these. It's kind of like walking on a waterbed. It moves underneath you. But they're long-term features on the landscape. So we've got some aerial photography, and some of these features have gone back at least 60 years and been on the landscape pretty much in the same place and size and so on that they are now. And historically, when on our natural areas, when we've had beaver impoundments, we've gotten concerned and upset and gone out and worrying about destruction of a forest community that's there now. And we've tried different things, I think, never with real success. We can temporarily trap them out or blow a dam or whatever. But when they really move into a watershed, I think we've changed our approach to some degree and kind of accepted sort of that they're an important part of the system. And we may not understand everything about what they do and how it works, but there's clearly rare grassland biodiversity that forms around these beaver marsh, valley bottom, open land communities. And I think I'd just be really interested in talking, even corresponding later with anybody else who's worked in that, because we're still trying to get our head around it. But I think it gets to what Mike was saying.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because this project itself has brought that up. And in Missouri, we typically don't deal with, in our bigger riverine systems, we've got water control structures and we have our own purposes of where we want water to go. And beavers are a pain in that regard. And so, out west, of course, beaver restoration is a big thing with streams and wetlands. And so it's kind of brought that into our consciousness a little bit here, and then seeing how this interaction, we do have, and one thing I didn't get into my presentation was the disjunct species that we have in these fins, and that are from, 10,000 years ago. And so, trying to protect that diversity, but I really think we're looking at I was expecting our soils to be a lot older, but then when we found these young soils, it's like, well, crap, how are they moving up and down these watersheds and these headwaters? And I think beavers probably did play a big contribution of that in that dynamic. How they're playing now, I'm not sure, but definitely something we found as we were looking at these different sites, and Kyle, the Forest Service, were looking at other locations. There was this definite connection with beavers, whether it's an abandoned dam on a site or elsewhere. There is this interplay, it seems like. So Yeah, I'm up for a discussion on beaver conservation and how they interact in these systems for sure. What are the trade-offs? What are the pluses and minuses? And yeah.
As I said, it almost seems like where we've had beaver issues as a negative are on really small natural areas where we have, you know, really limited amount of habitat for a specific rare species, where they're a definite negative to something like I was mentioning earlier, requiring thermal refugia from like the mouth of a spring. It seems like a nice problem to have at scale, where if you had a big chunk of land and many drainages, that sort of variation is good overall. But when you're managing little, you know, postage stamps of land, it's just too much impact in too small of an area.
Hey, Rich.
We've over the years tried to do pond levelers and that sort of thing on our own, and with mixed success, you know, leading us to kind of conclusions. Sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. We're starting to get it hooked up with some folks, I mean, that are really focusing on how to do them right. And I think in a year or so, we'll have a clear idea of whether that's going to work. But what I've seen so far is I think it's very, very encouraging that if you get hooked up to somebody who's really focused on how to do these things right, that's going to be that's going to be a workable solution for us. And our focus is really on our relatively small fen remnant, and where, you know, if you had a whole landscape to play with, the beaver raising and lowering water levels wouldn't be a big deal. But when those fens are, you know, pinched up against other areas where they can't move anymore, that you know, that's a real concern to us. And we're hoping that levelers is going to be a way of keeping areas from being inundated and lost.
One topic we didn't really, which would be a whole other series of talks, and which would be interesting to explore, is the influence of groundwater depletion on wetland communities. Especially we have issues with that in parts of our Mississippi River alluvial plain, and I know other states have, especially out west too, in the Platte River and Ogallala Aquifer. But that would be a whole other series of talks, but we really didn't touch on that today. But that would be another groundwater issue where wetlands are tied into those regional aquifers. And that could be an issue, I guess, maybe in Northwest Arkansas too, with all the development. I'm assuming maybe they're getting most of their water for use from reservoirs, but they may be pumping water too. And I know you guys have problems in the Delta there too with groundwater depletion. But that would be a whole other topic. I'm not sure if other folks have looked at that or not, but I know it's an issue.
Just wondering, thinking more about the beaver conversation, have any folks ever tried to manage beaver by attracting beaver to a preserve that they're not currently doing their jobs at? Or is it just kind of wait and see if they show up? Just curious.
Ryan, there's a lot of, I mean, we're talking about Eastern systems here today, but Ben Goldfarb brought a lot of that to light in his book, and he was the keynote at the 2020 conference, and he did talk about the introductions, the deliberate introductions in recent day to the Western Intermountain systems.
Yeah, I don't think we'll be doing any parachuting anytime soon here in the Blue Ridge, but yeah, no, thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, all of our activities have been controlled, so we haven't had at this point, we haven't thought of introducing them, but it is a kind of an interesting concept to think about in certain locations.
If you didn't follow up on Ben Goldfarb's presentation by reading his book, I would strongly recommend it. It really changed a lot of the ways I look at the landscape.
Yeah, honestly, that's where my question comes from. You know, thinking about first and second order streams in the mountains where there's visible evidence from past damage from logging and agriculture. And now these are second, third growth forests, but they still show this morphology of damage that if you consider what's written in that book by Ben Goldfarb, it seems like the idea of having beavers back in some of these mountainous stream valleys might be the right solution. So I was just curious if anybody else had dug in that direction anywhere in their management work.
Any other questions, discussion points, recommended books for the group?
I'm starting to hear the
Yeah.
crickets out here.
Okay.
It's pretty hot. Maybe people are they're done.
Sounds good, Mike. Why don't you go ahead and wrap it?
But yeah, I think this has been a good series, and there's a lot more to discuss with groundwater and beavers, and the effects of fire too on these, especially these smaller wetland systems. So I appreciate everybody's presentations and input. And the next roundtable will be in November, which will be more of a typical roundtable that we've had at conferences where states kind of do a little show and tell and talk about challenges, and then kind of have a more open forum, which of course, hopefully we can do that in Duluth in a coming year, which is nice to do that in person too, but that'll be our next roundtable. And then we still plan on doing these quarterly in the virtual format because it has worked out really well. And hopefully we can combine it with the in-person conference in the future. But thanks for everybody joining, and take care and enjoy the rest of summer.
Thanks to all of our presenters.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Take care.